You know what? India just demonstrated something that every strategic analyst should have seen coming, but somehow most people missed completely. And what they demonstrated isn't just about Indian foreign policy or BRICS dynamics. It's about the fundamental problem with assuming that shared opposition to American hegemony automatically creates shared interests in everything else. Because that assumption has been driving a lot of analysis about multipolar world order, BRICS expansion, and alternative institutional arrangements. The assumption that countries will stick together in challenging Western dominance because they all benefit from reducing American influence. But India just reminded everyone that countries have their own national interests that don't necessarily align with bloc interests, even when those countries are committed members of anti-hegemonic institutions. And that reality is forcing a much more complex conversation about how multipolarity actually works when it's not just theoretical discussion, but practical policymaking that affects economic relationships, security arrangements, and domestic political calculations. Let me break down what India is actually doing, because understanding Indian strategy is crucial to understanding whether institutions like BRICS represent genuine alternatives to Western-dominated systems or just talking shops where countries pursue their own agendas under multilateral cover. India's approach to BRICS membership has always been what you might call institutional hedging. They participate in BRICS initiatives that serve Indian interests while maintaining relationships and commitments that compete with BRICS objectives when those relationships serve Indian interests better. That's not necessarily hypocritical or duplicitous. That's rational foreign policy by a country that's trying to maximize opportunities while minimizing vulnerabilities in a complex global environment where different partnerships offer different benefits. The problem is that institutional hedging by major members undermines institutional effectiveness when those institutions are trying to create systematic alternatives to existing arrangements. BRICS can't function as an alternative to Western financial systems if major members maintain their primary relationships with Western financial systems. BRICS can't provide collective security against Western pressure if major members prioritize bilateral relationships with Western powers over collective BRICS commitments. BRICS can't develop into a coherent economic bloc if major members sign trade agreements with competitors that undermine BRICS economic coordination. And that's exactly what India's recent moves represent. Not abandonment of BRICS, but prioritization of bilateral relationships that serve Indian interests even when those relationships conflict with BRICS institutional objectives. The trade agreement with the United States that reduces tariffs on American goods while maintaining or increasing barriers to goods from other BRICS members. That's not just economic policy. That's strategic choice about which economic relationships India prioritizes. The decision to reduce Russian oil purchases despite the fact that Russian energy relationships were supposed to be a cornerstone of BRICS economic independence from Western sanctions regimes. That's not just energy policy. That's geopolitical positioning that affects the entire BRICS approach to resisting Western economic pressure. The continuation and expansion of security relationships with Western powers, including intelligence sharing, military exercises, and defense technology cooperation that directly conflicts with BRICS discussions about developing independent security architectures. Each individual decision might make sense from an Indian perspective. Collectively, they represent strategic choices that make BRICS institutional development much more difficult, if not impossible. But here's where this gets really interesting from a strategic analysis perspective. India's behavior isn't random or inconsistent with their historical foreign policy approach. This is exactly how India has operated for decades. During the Cold War, India was officially non-aligned, but maintained relationships with both superpowers while avoiding commitments that would limit their strategic flexibility. They took Soviet military aid while maintaining Western economic relationships. They criticized American policies while accepting American technological assistance. That approach served Indian interests well during the Cold War because it allowed India to benefit from competition between superpowers without getting trapped in exclusive relationships that would limit their options. Now, India is applying the same logic to the current global transition. They participate in BRICS as a hedge against complete Western dominance while maintaining Western relationships as a hedge against complete dependence on BRICS alternatives. From an Indian perspective, that's smart strategy that maximizes benefits while minimizing risks. From a BRICS institutional perspective, it's strategic incoherence that prevents collective action. And here's where the China-India dynamic becomes crucial to understanding why BRICS faces fundamental structural problems that go beyond Indian hedging strategies. China and India are strategic competitors regardless of their shared interest in challenging American hegemony. They have border disputes, regional influence competition, economic rivalry, and strategic objectives that conflict in fundamental ways. Chinese approaches to Asian development prioritize Chinese leadership and Chinese institutional arrangements. Indian approaches prioritize Indian independence and Indian institutional partnerships that don't require accepting Chinese leadership. Chinese energy security strategies depend on relationships with producers like Russia and Iran. Indian energy security strategies prioritize diversification that reduces dependence on any single supplier, including Chinese allies. Chinese financial strategies aim to create yuan-dominated alternatives to dollar systems. Indian financial strategies prioritize maintaining access to multiple financial systems without becoming dependent on Chinese alternatives to Western systems. These aren't minor disagreements that can be resolved through better communication or institutional design. These are structural conflicts between major powers that have different visions of how Asian and global order should develop. BRICS was supposed to provide a framework where these conflicts could be managed through shared opposition to Western dominance. But opposition to Western dominance doesn't eliminate competition between BRICS members, and sometimes that competition becomes more important than cooperation against Western influences. When China and India disagree about fundamental strategic directions, India has incentives to maintain Western relationships as alternatives to potential Chinese dominance within BRICS. China has incentives to develop BRICS in ways that serve Chinese strategic objectives, even if that makes India uncomfortable. Russia has incentives to support whatever BRICS arrangements provide the most support for Russian resistance to Western pressure, regardless of whether those arrangements serve Chinese or Indian interests better. Brazil and South Africa have their own regional priorities that don't necessarily align with any of the major powers' strategic objectives. The result is an institution where members pursue divergent strategies under collective cover rather than developing coherent alternatives to Western arrangements. But let's talk about what American strategy makers are trying to achieve by courting individual BRICS members. Because understanding American approaches to institutional competition helps explain why Indian hedging creates opportunities for undermining BRICS effectiveness. The American strategy isn't necessarily trying to break up BRICS directly. That would be obvious and would probably strengthen BRICS cohesion by creating external pressure that forces internal cooperation. Instead, the approach seems to be offering individual BRICS members relationships and benefits that serve their national interests better than exclusive BRICS relationships would serve those interests. Trade agreements that provide market access and investment opportunities, technology partnerships that support development priorities, security cooperation that addresses regional concerns, financial arrangements that provide alternatives to Chinese-dominated systems. None of these require abandoning BRICS membership. They just require prioritizing bilateral relationships with the United States over collective relationships within BRICS when those priorities conflict. That's much more sophisticated than trying to force countries to choose between American relationships and BRICS membership. It creates conditions where countries naturally prioritize American relationships because those relationships provide more concrete benefits. And it works particularly well with India because Indian strategic culture already prioritizes flexibility and hedging over exclusive institutional commitments. The result is that India gets benefits from both BRICS participation and American partnerships, while BRICS gets weakened by Indian participation that's always conditional on Indian interests rather than institutional interests. This represents a broader pattern in how institutional competition actually works in multipolar systems. Institutions compete not just through their official arrangements, but through their ability to provide concrete benefits that serve member interests better than alternative arrangements. When Western institutions provide better benefits to potential members than non-Western alternatives provide, membership in non-Western institutions becomes mainly symbolic rather than practically significant. That's exactly what's happening with Indian BRICS membership. India participates in BRICS when participation serves Indian interests and prioritizes other relationships, when those relationships serve Indian interests better. BRICS can't develop institutional effectiveness when major members treat membership as one option among many rather than as a primary commitment that requires subordinating other relationships to institutional objectives. But here's what really concerns me about these developments from a global stability perspective. The fragility of alternative institutions like BRICS doesn't necessarily strengthen existing Western institutions. It might just increase global institutional chaos. When BRICS can't develop effective alternatives to Western arrangements, countries that are dissatisfied with Western arrangements don't necessarily return to accepting Western arrangements. They might pursue unilateral approaches that avoid institutional commitments entirely. When countries can't trust multilateral institutions to serve their interests reliably, they start prioritizing bilateral relationships and national strategies that reduce their dependence on any institutional arrangements. When institutional competition produces institutional weakness rather than institutional improvement, everyone becomes more vulnerable to economic disruption, security instability, and political chaos that affects global relationships generally. The failure of alternative institutions to provide viable alternatives doesn't automatically restore the effectiveness of existing institutions. It might just accelerate the breakdown of institutional approaches to global problem solving. And institutional breakdown affects everyone, including Americans who depend on institutional arrangements for trade relationships, security cooperation, and economic stability. Let's talk about what this means for regular people in all the countries involved, because institutional dynamics ultimately affect economic opportunities, security arrangements, and political stability in ways that determine how ordinary families live and work. For Indians, institutional hedging creates opportunities but also vulnerabilities. Access to multiple markets, technologies, and partnerships that exclusive relationships wouldn't provide, but also exposure to pressure from multiple directions when different partnerships conflict. Indian businesses benefit from access to both American markets and Chinese supply chains, Russian energy and Middle Eastern investments, European technology, and African resources. But they also face uncertainty when those relationships create competing demands and conflicting requirements. Indian workers benefit from economic growth that comes from diversified partnerships, but they also face instability when geopolitical competition affects economic relationships that Indian communities depend on. For Americans, Indian hedging represents both opportunities and challenges. Opportunities to build relationships that serve American strategic objectives without requiring comprehensive alliance commitments that India won't accept, but also challenges in building institutional arrangements that serve American interests when partners maintain relationships with competitors that could undermine American strategic objectives. American businesses benefit from access to Indian markets and partnerships, but they also face uncertainty when Indian policies prioritize relationships with competitors over relationships with American companies. For Chinese strategic planners, Indian behavior within BRICS demonstrates the limitations of institutional approaches to challenging Western dominance when member countries prioritize national interests over institutional objectives. China can't use BRICS to develop systematic alternatives to Western arrangements when major BRICS members maintain their primary relationships with Western systems. But Chinese institutional alternatives can't succeed through coercion or pressure that would drive countries back toward Western arrangements. They have to succeed through attraction and mutual benefit that serves member interests better than existing alternatives. For Russians, Indian hedging represents the broader challenge of building sustainable partnerships with countries that aren't willing to accept the same level of confrontation with Western powers that Russian strategic situation requires. Russia needs partners who will resist Western pressure effectively, but most potential partners prefer managing relationships with all major powers rather than choosing sides in confrontations that don't serve their direct interests. The broader implications for global order are that institutional multipolarity is proving much more difficult to achieve than theoretical discussions suggested. Countries want alternatives to Western dominance, but they don't necessarily want exclusive alternatives that require abandoning all relationships with Western institutions. They want competitive institutional environments that give them choices and reduce their vulnerabilities, rather than alternative dependencies that create new vulnerabilities. The challenge for institutional design is creating arrangements that provide genuine alternatives without requiring exclusive commitments that most countries aren't willing to make. That's probably going to require much more flexible and limited institutional arrangements than either Western or non-Western institutions have traditionally provided. Institutions that serve specific functional needs rather than comprehensive relationships. Institutions that allow multiple memberships and overlapping commitments rather than requiring exclusive loyalty. Institutions that compete through better service rather than through pressure for comprehensive alignment. India's approach to BRICS membership demonstrates both the appeal and the limitations of this kind of flexible institutional participation. It provides India with options and hedging opportunities that serve Indian interests, but it also limits institutional effectiveness in ways that reduce the benefits that institutions can provide to any of their members. The future of global institutional arrangements probably depends on finding approaches that balance flexibility with effectiveness better than current arrangements achieve. That requires understanding that countries like India aren't being duplicitous when they maintain multiple relationships. They're being rational about maximizing benefits while minimizing risks in a complex global environment. But it also requires understanding that institutional effectiveness requires some level of commitment and coordination that pure flexibility makes impossible to achieve. The question isn't whether India should choose BRICS over Western relationships or Western relationships over BRICS. The question is whether institutional arrangements can be designed that serve member interests effectively while accommodating the kind of strategic flexibility that countries like India require for their own security and prosperity. And answering that question probably determines whether multipolarity develops through institutional competition that improves services for everyone, or through institutional breakdown that serves nobody's long-term interests. Right now, Indian strategy suggests that institutional breakdown might be more likely than institutional improvement. Because when major countries prioritize flexibility over institutional commitments, institutions can't develop the coherence and effectiveness that makes them valuable to anyone. That's not necessarily India's fault. That might be the fundamental problem with trying to build alternative institutions in a global environment where countries have legitimate reasons to avoid exclusive commitments that limit their strategic options. But it's definitely a problem that affects everyone's interests in maintaining global arrangements that provide stability, predictability, and mutual benefit rather than chaos, uncertainty, and zero-sum competition. The challenge is whether institutional designers can develop arrangements that work with rather than against the strategic flexibility that countries like India require, while still providing the coordination and effectiveness that global problems require. That's the real test of whether multipolarity leads to better global governance or just more complicated global chaos.